the strongest people in the world to be able to deal with some of this stuff. But from a rural perspective, is the Fed doing anything in particular that I could take back to my constituents and say, this is what the Fed's doing to help rein in inflation in rural areas?
Well, so we are, of course, well aware. As you know, we have 4 or 5 Reserve Bank presidents who have very large agricultural economies within their districts, and we hear, excellent reports from them about what's going on. And it's clearly a tremendously challenging situation. Fertilizer prices and all kinds of inputs, very, very difficult situation. You can't get parts for your equipment and that kind of thing. So. Overall, we do appreciate that. You're not seeing this yet, but when if times do get difficult, then we work carefully with borrowers in the Farm Belt and that kind of thing, because we know, that's what you do in those kind of times. We're not at that times at this point, but that's one thing we have done in the past. I mean, overall, we think we need to get back to price stability, and that will help. That will help everybody. It will help the whole economy. Including rural America. Okay, interest rates. I know they've been raised a bit recently, I think 3/4 of a point, correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm not going to ask you where interest rates need to be, but I do think that there's a fine line to walk, and you tell me if I'm wrong, where if interest rates are raised too high, it could drive us into a recession. Can you tell me some of the things you're looking at to make sure that doesn't happen? Sure. So when we pivoted and started talking about raising rates last year, markets have priced in rate increases so that all out the curve of debt maturities, interest rates have already moved up to reflect interest rate increases that we haven't actually made yet to our. So what we have right now is a low short-term rate, which is our policy rate. So, and the increase that we made one decision at the last meeting, which was to raise by 75 basis points, but only to 1.6%. So, and we thought that was the right thing to do. I'm happy to discuss why. But really, the point is that our policy rate is still at a relatively low level. And in principle, we want to get it up to a more neutral-ish level. The concern, I don't think, is about the level. It was with the speed. Are we moving too quickly? And
مساء الخير للجميع. مساء الخير. هلا المفروض صوتي واضح. أنا بدي أسمع هنا وإن شاء الله بعملكم ترجمة أول بأول ونشوف شو بيحكوا لهم. هو لحد الآن يا إخواني الجلسة كالآتي. البرلمانيين عملوا معه جلسة على الأقل ممكن نحكي تحقيق شو اللي بيصير حاليا وشو سبب الارتفاع المستمر في الأسعار وليش لحد الآن مش قادرين يسيطروا على الأسعار. ففي أحد الأشخاص بهدل وحكى له يعني صار يصيح يعني قال له أنت يعني وين ما خدنا الأسعار مش راضية تتوقف وأنت قاعد تلوم دول أخرى. أنا ما بتهمني الدول الأخرى، أنا بدي أعرف وين إحنا دولتنا متجهة الآن مع كل الارتفاع في الأسعار الغير متوقف والرفع المستمر للفائدة والانهيار الاقتصادي اللي بيصير حاليا.
To raise rates above a neutral level into a modestly restrictive level because this is very high inflation and it's hurting everybody and we need to
إنه هذا يعني تضخم مرتفع جدا وهذا الجميع. أتصور الأسواق العالمية حتى كانت عندها ردة فعل إيجابية للجلسة هذه. هات نشوف.
We see we're really strongly committed to getting inflation down to 2%, but we're going to be flexible as we see the data coming in.
Do you agree with the perspective, and then I'll be done, but do you agree with the perspective that if interest rates go too high, too fast, it could drive us into a recession?
It's certainly a possibility. Intended outcome at all, but it's certainly a possibility. And frankly, the events of the last few months around the world have made it more difficult for us to achieve what we want, which is 2% inflation.
سألوا عن الركود.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Haggerty of Senate.
سألوا قال له أنت تتفق إنه ارتفاع في الأسعار المستمر ورفع الفائدة ممكن يؤدي فينا إلى ركود؟ قال له نعم ممكن.
Is the fact that the Federal Reserve and then by extension the American taxpayer is essentially taking a long position in the securities that's acquired.
لن يخفضوا الفائدة أخي لن يخفضوا الفائدة.
When rates rise, the value of the securities on your balance sheet drop. That's exactly what's happening today. And as of March of this year, The Federal Reserve had about $330 billion worth of unrealized loss on its balance sheet. That number is probably close to $500 billion right now, given the rise in rates. So my question of you is, do these unrealized losses limit the Federal Reserve's ability to execute its monetary policy objectives? And specifically, will the Fed sell mortgage-backed securities and realize a loss? Or will the Fed be cornered into holding these securities until they appreciate?
So those kind of unrealized losses play no role in our decision making, have no effect at all.
بيحكي له انه خساره البنك الفدرالي ما بتاثرش علينا لانه عندهم على الشيت على الموقع تبعهم انه عندهم خساره لحد الان اكثر من $500 تريليون 500 مليار دولار.
Yes, we said we would look at selling MBS when the normalization process for the balance sheet was well underway. And that means not soon. We haven't decided exactly what that means. When we make that decision, and the reason, by the way, the reason we want to do that balance sheet.
الامور مش كويسه له يا اخوان، اتبهدل كثير، اتبهدل لانه على ما يبدو انه مودي امريكا على ريسيشن كبير يعني.
Treasury balance sheet, we may well need to sell MBS at some future date. When we turn to that, we're going to be very transparent and give lots of transparency, obviously, but we won't be thinking about the balance sheet. I mean, remember
الدولار بدأ ينزل. شوف أول ما عملوا الاجتماع معاه الدولار نزل.
To the Treasury over the course of the last 10 years. The reason we don't have a lot of capital is that we give our earnings to the Treasury every year. So it's not at all a concern for us.
But to be clear, these long-dated mortgage-backed securities may be sold as a loss. You're not limiting your ability to do that, to sell at a loss.
No.
And that could happen. I just think the downside of quantitative easing is very much illustrated for us when you find yourself in this situation of holding these long-dated securities. To turn to another point, Chairman Powell, I realize there are a number of factors that play a role in the historic inflation that we're experiencing. Supply chain disruptions, regulations that constrain supply. We've got rising inflation expectations and excessive fiscal spending.
تخيل بحكي له لسه متوقع التضخم يستمر، تخيلوا.
In January of 2021, inflation was at 1.4%. By December of 2021, it had risen to 7%, a five-fold increase. Now, since the war in Ukraine began in late February, the rate of inflation has risen incrementally, another 1.6%, to a current level of 8.6%. So again, from 7% to 8.6%. Given how inflation has escalated over the past 18 months, would you say that the war in Ukraine is the primary driver of inflation in America?
بحكي له هل حرب يوكران هي السبب الرئيسي للتضخم؟
Ukraine broke out.
I'm glad to hear you say that. The Biden administration seems to be intent on deflecting blame, and as recently as just this past Sunday, spread the misinformation that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is the, quote, biggest single driver of inflation. I'm glad you agree.
بحكي له لا مش هذا، بحكي له يعني بايدن بيكذب انه هو بيحكي انه الحرب تبعت اوكرانيا هي اللي بتضخم، فشكرا لك لتوضيح هاي النقاط المهمة جدا.
More than 60% of executives expect a recession in the next 18 months. Meanwhile, per its most recent forecast, the Fed will be tightening monetary policy for the next 2.5 years. Thus, the Fed could soon find itself in the challenging position of potentially exacerbating an economic downturn in order to address the historic inflation that's been unleashed by the Biden administration. So, Mr. Chairman, as you know, the Fed has a dual mandate, stable prices and maximum employment. As we look to the fall, how do you think about balancing this potential tension between the Fed's two mandates, particularly if the economic outlook worsens, but inflation remains elevated?
So we do have a dual mandate, as you point out. Right now, the labor market is extremely tight and I would say unsustainably hot. There's a mismatch between supply and demand there. As you know, there's more job openings than there are, by a factor of 2 to 1, than there are unemployed people looking for work. On the inflation side, we're very far from our target. So we think that we have to restore price stability to put the economy back in a place where in the medium and longer term we can have what we would call maximum employment. So that's how we're thinking about it. Of course, we're not trying to provoke and don't think that we will need to provoke a recession, but we do think it's absolutely essential that we restore price stability.
بحكي له احنا بنحاولش انه نعمل ركود، لكن احنا واجبنا انه نوقف التضخم ونجيب استقرار في الاسعار. يعني الوضع جدا سيء يا اخواني في امريكا على ما يبدو، والله اعلم.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome back to the committee. Chair Powell, it's good to see you again. I want to follow up on this issue of this imbalance between labor demand and supply, as you were just referring to. According to the latest figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
لا على فكرة أنا مع العضو لأنه حكومة بايدن بتحاول تلوم الحرب الأمريكية الحرب الروسية، والموضوع ملوش علاقة نهائيا في الحرب الروسية، هي سياسة البنك الفدرالي اللي دخلت أمريكا في هذا الوضع. وعلى ما يبدو يا إخواني الأمور محرجة جدا في أمريكا، الوضع الاقتصادي على حفرة يعني في الوضع الحالي. أتصور إنه ما بدهمش هذا الشيء، يعني الأمور يعني شوف الدولار حتى يعني لحد الآن من بداية هذا الدولار هابط. شوف الدولار كيف كان في الساعات الثلاث اللي فاتوا، بس لحد الآن هبوط.
Are too high and that they need to come down in order to rein in inflation.
So it isn't that wages themselves are too high, it's that the rate of growth of wages is not consistent, and I'll explain this, not consistent with 2% inflation over time. So, of course, it's great when wages go up, and we want them to go up. We want people to get, strong wage increases, but at a certain point, wages become high enough that companies start raising prices, and you wind up getting high inflation. So if you just kind of reverse engineer what level of wage increases would be consistent with 2% inflation over the longer term, today's wage increases, if you look across the numbers of measures that we look at, they're significantly above that. Now, there's some evidence that they're flattening out. Particularly average hourly earnings, there's some
لا الجلسة هذه ما لهاش علاقة بالحكومة الأمريكية نهائيا فيش مزح هلا، يعني هلا هذه الأمور صارت، يعني هذه دليل على إنه الأمور أصبحت يعني وصلت يعني لمرحلة صعبة جدا، وأمريكا خايفة من الركود حاليا لأن الوضع حساس. بتعرف حرب أوكرانيا وتحسن اقتصاد روسيا بيلعب دور.
Would start to go down.
So
are they ever going to go down?
It depends in.
سألته إذا الأسعار ممكن تنزل.
For inflation to.
أكيد مش راح تنزل.
Remain at the same level, inflation goes to zero. But it depends on different businesses. In some service, in parts of the service economy, labor costs are a very large portion of costs, and so.
إن شاء الله يوصل تحت 100 تحت 100 خلاص معناها ترند هابط، تحت 100 ترند هابط بإذن الله.
We would think that pass-through should be shown fairly quickly in some parts of the economy, in others less so. But over time, we would want wages to be moving up at the highest sustainable rate that's possible.
Right.
And consistent with 2% inflation.
And of course, at the same time, the economy, we've got this very, very strong labor market, but simultaneously we continue to see higher unemployment rates among African Americans, for example, nearly double the unemployment of white Americans. So how do you see this sort of interplay between wage growth and what the Fed actions to cool demand on that
في حال انه راح راح يتركوا التضخم زي ما هو، اكيد راح يكون ايجابي، لكن هلا بدنا نشوف احنا بالنسبه لنا شو النتائج هنا، اذا في نتائج ولا اذا في كلام دليل على خوف كبير.
So that's really how we think about it. In terms of the disparities, we saw those disparities increase significantly at the beginning of the pandemic and then reverse as we pointed out in our monetary policy report. Those gaps have at least return to historically lower levels. There's still gaps though, and those are not really gaps that we can get at with monetary policy. But we point them out because they're an important aspect of our economy, and we do consider them as we think about appropriate policy.
I think I would agree with you. I think that those are sort of systemic challenges in our economy that need to be addressed through the.
الدولار راح يكون صاعد في حال إن هبوط الدولار أخي. في حال اتجاه الدولار لترند هابط الأسواق راح ترتفع إن شاء الله، خصوصا الأسواق التقليدية اللي راح تكون إيجابية على الكريبتو بشكل عام.
To do the jobs that our economy is creating. But it also seems to me that as long as wage growth is lagging inflation, that in some ways labor costs are actually dampening inflationary pressures because they're not keeping up with inflation. So I think it's just an interesting and complicated issue.
No argument there.
Yeah. Well, I just have a couple of minutes left. I'm not going to have a chance to get into this, but I'm quite interested also in this, that what we're seeing around the country everywhere, and especially in Minnesota, about extraordinarily high increases in housing. The Fed is raising interest rates which is going to
اسألوا عن أسعار البيوت.
have an impact on increasing housing prices because mortgage prices are going to go up and other costs going up in terms of building housing is going to go up. So I'm just interested in how you sort of weigh that dilemma.
So, after the pandemic,
رئيس مجلس البنك الفدرالي أقوى رجل في أمريكا، أقوى رجل في أمريكا.
rates were low, but also people decided they wanted to live more in housing, single-family homes rather than downtown. And so prices went up all over the country at very, very high levels. Now you see the housing market slowing down because you see higher rates are having an effect. That should have an effect on housing prices, perhaps even fairly quickly, so that prices won't necessarily come down, but price increases will flatten out. We're seeing lower home sales, we're seeing lower starts, so we're seeing a slowing in housing. And, ideally we would, the very low settings of rates during the pandemic were appropriate, but part of what that did was it supported a lot of demand for housing. Maybe we're going to get back to a place where supply and demand are closer. I will say, I agree with you on the labor shortage issue, which is a longer-term issue that we have, but also with housing, there are constraints on housing construction, so that it's very possible that we'll be in a position where there isn't enough appropriate housing at the right price, and that's a longer-run issue. Again, not so much for us as for you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Lummis of Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for being with us today. It'll come as no surprise to you that I want to focus on digital assets and Fed master accounts. So my first question is about the accounting treatment of digital assets, specifically SEC Staff Accounting Bulletin 121. So this bulletin requires publicly traded companies, including banks, to hold digital assets in custody.
لحد الآن يا إخوان الأمور واضح إنه أمريكا بدها تواجه الموضوع، لكن الأسعار اللي بترتفع كل يوم، هذا الحديث مش راح يهمنا لأنه هذا بيتكلم عن المؤسسات والشركات، فشوي ندردش عن اللي صار. أسئلة مهمة جدا بحكي له إنه يعني وين أنت متجه فينا، يعني أنت حقنت تقريبا 20 تريليون في الاقتصاد الأمريكي أو في الاقتصاد العالمي، بعدين سحبتهم، يعني أنت سحبت الأموال ما فيش مشكلة، لكن الأسعار ما زالت في قيد الارتفاع، يعني ما زالت مستمرة في الارتفاع. فبدنا نعرف إجابة منك إمتى ممكن هذه الأمور توقف، إمتى ممكن نشوف انخفاض في الأسعار، إمتى ممكن نشوف توقف للتضخم، انخفاض في الفائدة وما ندخلش في ريسيشن. يعني هو بيحكي له، حتى في أحد الأسئلة أجته بتحكي له إنه هل أنت بتعرف إنه إذا استمرينا في الصعود الحالي للتضخم ورفع سعر الفائدة والوضع الحالي إنه إحنا ممكن نتوجه للركود؟ حكى له ممكن نتوجه للركود. نعم، هبوط الدولار ممكن يكون إيجابي إن شاء الله. هل الأمور إيجابية أم سلبية؟ والله يا هيثم مش راح تبين، أكيد هي مش راح تبين، لكن دليل على إنه الوضع في أمريكا مش جيد. يعني حتى البنك الفدرالي واضح جدا إنه بتخبط، والقرارات راح تكون صعبة على ما يبدو.
Bank standards.
القرارات راح تكون غير متوقعة يا شباب، غير متوقعة، ما حداش بيعرف إيش راح نتجه الآن. يعني كل واحد يكون مستعد. أكيد الاستثمار يعني بتعرفوا على المدى القصير راح يكون في تذبذب كبير جدا، لحد ما نتأكد من توجه الدولار. في حال كسرنا 101 أكيد هذا ترند هابط يعني.
But my understanding of it is the same as yours, though, which is custody assets are
بايدن دائما في خطاباته بيحكي انه اسعار ارتفاع المحروقات او البنزين او الاسعار بسبب حرب اوكرانيا، فهو بيحكي له ممكن توضح انه هل صحيح انه الارتفاع الحالي والتضخم هو بسبب حرب اوكرانيا؟ هل تتفق مع حكومة بايدن اللي بتحاول تلوم الحرب الاوكرانية الروسية دائما في كل حديث معها؟ فبيحكي له لا، مش بسبب الحرب الاوكرانية، لكن هي احد الاسباب لكن ليست السبب الرئيسي. فبيحكي له شكرا لتوضيح هذه النقطة المهمة اللي دائما بيحاول بايدن يستخدمها لا تبرير الارتفاع الحالي في الاسعار. فعلى ما يبدو انه هم حتى مش راضيين عن حكومة بايدن يا اخوان.
Referred by the Fed to a private institution. And since a master account is a public benefit, really doesn't the
لا هم بدهم يعرفوا شو بده ياخذ اجراءات. لا هو اكيد اذا في حاله الامور صارت سيئه اكيد ممكن ياخذ القرارات، لكن هذا الرجل بول جيروم بول هذا هو الرجل الرئيسي، فهمت علي؟ يعني هو اللي بياخذ القرارات. شكله راح يضل ماخذ قرار رفع الفائده يعني على ما يبدو. الدولار لا مش راح يضله صاعد، لا مستحيل، ما اتصورش يضله صاعد للأبد يعني، بس احنا بنستنى ان شاء الله
project
نشوف توجه للترند الهابط.
publicly available a list of institutions that have received master accounts, as well as the institutions that have applied and not received them.
So I'll be glad to look into that. You know our system well, and it really is that the Fed, the board, you know, we set rules, but the reserve banks really make the decisions about granting accounts subject to those rules. And we actually think we can improve on that system with the current proposal we have, and are considering comments on that right now, as I'm sure you know very well.
Yeah, and as you also know that applicants for master accounts are getting whipsawed between the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the bank.
كله رفع الفائدة، هذا ترقيع أخي، ترقيع للاقتصاد المنهار حاليا صراحة. لا هم راح يرفعوا الضرائب حاليا على الفدرالي. أكيد الركود سيء، أكيد الركود سيء أخي، هو بيحكي له احتمال إنه يصير ركود، بس على ما يبدو إنه أمريكا إذا دخلت ركود مصيبة، لأنه راح يكون ركود مؤلم للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، خصوصا في الوضع الحالي. فهم أتصور إنهم بيحاولوا يتجنبوا هذا الموضوع، لكن ما أتصورش في الطريقة هاي ممكن يتجنبوه، ما أتصورش، لأنه لحد الآن يعني شوف عندك الدولار شوي طلع، هبط رد طلع.
And I wish to just once again use this opportunity to encourage you to address that. There's just no excuse. There's no excuse anymore, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
لا ما سألتش عن الكريبتو أخي، لا ما أظنش. ديجيتال أسيتس أخي هذه أصول رقمية ما لهاش علاقة بالكريبتو.
Chairman Powell, I can't let an opportunity go by without raising the issue of the FedNow real-time payments system implementation. You would agree that if we can get the system into place, it will save millions of Americans billions of dollars, would you not?
Yes, I would.
And so that's why I just want to encourage you to move very quickly. As you know, the system is scheduled to go up next year. We had an earlier hearing in May in this committee, and Brookings Senior Fellow Aaron Klein, who's spent a lot of time monitoring this system, shared his concern that we weren't moving fast enough to hit that date and fully implement it. So I just want your commitment, Mr. Chairman, that you are focused on this and that it is a priority.
Very much so. We're very focused on doing it right and also on time. And that's next year.
Right, because it especially impacts, of course, people living paycheck to paycheck, right, who make a deposit in a bank, but it doesn't clear. And then they get tagged with all sorts of overcharge fees and things like that. So I just, you know, other countries that are a lot less advanced in terms of technology, the United States have figured this out, and we should be there now. I just want to turn to really the issue of the day, which is this challenge in navigating between keeping a strong economy moving and low unemployment,
سأله سؤال مهم.
price stability. On the good news front, and I think you've testified to this earlier, the United States is doing a lot better than our sort of near peer economies when it comes to economic growth and quickly reducing our unemployment rate. Isn't that the case?
Yes, generally we're further advanced in our recovery, I would say.
Yeah. So that's good news, and we want to keep that going. We also obviously want to deal with the price increases. And, you know, the concern which has been shared by others this morning is that many of the causes of those price increases are beyond the control of the Fed. And I call them the 3 Ps: Putin's war, pandemic supply chain disruptions, price gouging. Senator Cortez Masto raised that. And so I think the challenge is, how do you navigate increases in interest rates when a lot of the drivers of price increases are beyond your control? And I want to raise a specific kind of case study here, which is in the housing market. Because you would agree, would you not, that increasing the supply of housing can help reduce housing prices, right?
Sure.
Yeah. But what we're seeing now is that with rising interest rates, obviously new investments are more expensive. We've seen housing starts fall by 14% in May. So that means fewer housing opportunities, less supply, fewer workers engaged in building new homes. So if you could just use that as a sort of case study of how you're going to navigate these cross currents.
So interest-sensitive spending is a very important aspect of how our tools work. And in the case of the housing market, what you're seeing is higher mortgage rates. So you're actually seeing demand move down quite significantly. Many indicators suggest that fewer people are visiting homes. The wait time for selling a home is increasing. Housing sales are moving down. Housing starts are moving down. And overall, it's a slowing in the housing market. And I think what you will see, or many forecasts call for the increase in housing prices to slow pretty significantly now. You've seen very large, as you know, increases in housing prices over really since the beginning of the pandemic, and to the point where, all over the country you have housing, people, 5 bids above the ask the second the house comes on the market. Well, that's cooling off now to a more sustainable pace. So what we hope is we can get demand, that part of the economy to slow to a more sustainable pace, and get the housing market back on a more sustainable path where there's a better balance between supply and demand.
I appreciate that. I'm just going to use my remaining time to sort of push you a little further on this issue, not specifically with housing, but given the fact that so many of the factors that are driving price increases are beyond our control, and you talked about core inflation, what is your confidence level that we will have what is generally referred to as a soft landing, where we won't overcorrect in raising our interest rates to the point that it begins to really hurt our economy, workers, and wages? What is your level of confidence that you can navigate a soft landing for the economy?
مهم جدا هذا الكلام.
It is going to be very challenging. It has been made significantly more challenging by the events of the last few months, thinking there of the war and commodities prices and further problems with supply chains. And the question of whether we're able to accomplish that is going to depend to some extent on factors that we don't control.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I could, but this is the point I think many of us are making. The factors that are out of your control are not going to be susceptible to those costs being brought down: oil, gas, I heard you earlier, food, by the measures you're taking, and the risk is that the measures
واو سؤال مهم جدا يا اخوان. هلا راح اشرح لكم.
Other parts of the economy without getting us the benefit of lower prices. So I think that is a big theme today.
سؤال هذا ممكن خطر على كل المستثمرين.
Conversation about how you're going to thread that needle.
Can I say that the other risk, though, is that we would not manage to restore price stability and that we would allow this high inflation to get entrenched in our economy. And we know from history that will hurt the people we'd like to help, the people in the lower income spectrum, who suffer now from high inflation. That will hurt them more than anyone. So that we can't fail on that task. We have to get back to 2% inflation so that we can have the kind of labor market that we really want.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, but as you know, the prices that people are experiencing most vividly day to day is the price of gas at the pump and the price at food at the grocery store, both of which are things that you've said are beyond your control. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Daines from Untitled.
سألوا سؤال مهم جدا. قال له في عوامل خارجة عن سيطرتك اللي هي حرب روسيا وارتفاع أسعار السلع ونقص السلع الغذائية بسبب الكورونا، وأيضا موضوع اللي هو البترول. قال له هذه العوامل مش في إيدك، مش في سيطرتك زي ما أنت حكيت. كيف ممكن توازن ما بين رفع الفائدة والعوامل اللي هي مش في إيدك أنت؟ طب هل عندك أنت ثقة كاملة إنك أنت راح تقدر تسيطر على التضخم من دون ما تودينا لركود اقتصادي، مع إنه العوامل المؤثرة على التضخم ليست في يدك؟ يعني موضوع الحرب وهي الأمور مش في إيدك، أنت كيف بدك تنزل التضخم بأمور أنت مش مسيطر عليها؟ فقال له في عنا حل إنه نترك الأمور تتضخم، يعني نترك التضخم يستمر إلى ما لا نهاية وارتفاع، لكن هذا راح يكون انعكاسه سلبي على المواطنين. بس قال له هو لما سأله حكى له بس ما هو كمان أيضا الارتفاع اللي بنشوفه حاليا اليوم يعني كمان أيضا مضر، يعني مضر. فعلى ما يبدو يا إخواني إنه عندهم قرار، يعني ممكن نحكي إنه البنك الفدرالي الآن بس هدفه إنه يخفض التضخم مهما كانت التكاليف، والبرلمان الامريكي ما بدوش يدخل في ركود، لكن على ما يبدو يا اخواني انهم راح يدخلوهم في ركود اذا استمر الوضع زي هيك، لانه العوامل خارجه عن ايدين او سيطره البنك الفدرالي.
In this very room, similar hearings, warning our colleagues about the risks of moving through a $2 trillion spending package when we had $1 trillion of unspent COVID money still remaining in December of the prior year. Let me quote from that Washington Post article. It says, Summers, of course, now remember Secretary Treasurer Clinton and economic advisor to Barack Obama, a Democrat, Summers, age 66, who drafted economic blueprints for the past two Democratic presidents and was a top candidate to lead the Federal Reserve Board under President Obama, has emerged in recent weeks as the loudest critic of President Biden's approach to reviving the pandemic-era U.S. economy. The Harvard University professor who advised Biden for a time last summer warns, and this is key, that the president's stimulus plan may trigger the highest inflation in more than half a century and could cost Democrats the chance to make lasting investments in the economy. There were many of us warning the administration and our colleagues across the aisle of blindly moving forward on a purely partisan basis to jam through that $2 trillion package and the inflationary risk associated with it. Now, with inflation at a 40-year high, these same Democrats are continuing their ill-advised effort to revise President Biden's sweeping Build Back Broke package, no matter the warning signs that are flashing right now in all of our faces. Chairman Powell, Mr. Summers has suggested several years of greater than 5% unemployment might be necessary to contain inflation. Would you agree with that assessment?
I guess I would say that I don't want to comment on other forecasts generally, but my assessment is that it's going to depend to a significant extent on factors like how long does the war run and how long does it take supply chains to improve and that kind of thing. There's a lot of uncertainty around that. I would have a lot of humility about trying to, predict
بلوم الحرب كمان بلوم الحرب
the economy is going to be in, the next 3 years, for example. But my assessment, though, is that there's certainly paths to get inflation down to 2% with outcomes that are substantially less, troubling.
بلومبرج أخي بلومبرج.
You've characterized a soft landing as getting back to 2% inflation while keeping the labor market strong. What's your confidence that the Fed can achieve this goal without causing a recession?
بحكي له شو ثقة البنك الفدرالي إنه يخفض التضخم ل 2% من دون ما يعمل ركود.
I think it's going to be very challenging. We've never said it was going to be easy or straightforward. It's going to be challenging, and
حتكون صعبة.
The events of the last few months have certainly made it more challenging. And nonetheless, there are pathways through which that could happen. And in particular, what we saw in the early part of 2021 when inflation went up was very strong demand surged against what were unanticipated supply-side constraints. And the result was prices went up a lot, much more than could be explained by just the increase in demand. And so in principle, if demand can move back down, then inflation could move back along that path just as quickly as it went up. In principle, no one's guaranteeing that, but the idea is this is not the same. There are relationships in the economy for how quickly inflation would move compared to demand moving. This could be an unusual situation because we have had what is in effect a vertical. There isn't any more supply or a very steep supply curve. Increases in prices, you could get sharp declines for the same reason. So that could be.
حيزيد الفائدة أخي.
We'll find out, ideally, but ultimately we need to see progress on the supply side, and we're not waiting for it. Our job and our tools work on demand. And that's what we're working on now, is getting demand down to a more sustainable level.
بحكي له احنا بنحاول نخفض الطلب، يعني طلب الناس على الشراء وعلى كل شيء، هذا مش عارف كيف بده يعملوها، هذه صعبة جدا من دون دخول في ركود.
On behalf of the chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Mr. Chairman, welcome back. Let me state at the outset, you have an extraordinarily challenging job in extraordinarily complex times, and much of what you are responding to and adapting to is beyond your control. Your success is the country's success to a significant extent. It's the world's success, and I fervently hope for your success and appreciate your continued efforts. I'd like to ask you to specify, if you can, what transmission mechanisms you believe are most sensitive right now to the change in monetary policy, what forms of consumption you expect to be most sensitive to it, and the extent to which you anticipate that some of the effects that you hope to have on aggregate demand through the increase in rates are transmitted via financial markets, and if so, how?
So I guess I would say three basic channels through which our tools work. The first would be interest-sensitive spending. So that's durables, including cars and things like that, durable goods. Housing, for example. So when rates go up, spending on those purchases, which tend to be financed with debt, will be restrained. That's one major channel. The second is just asset prices generally across the economy. When interest rates go up, it raises the cost of holding assets. It can cause assets, again, broadly across the economy to either moderate their growth or decline somewhat in value. And that has an effect a broad effect across the economy on spending on everything. The third channel is really the exchange rate, which you can think of as another asset price, but that also has the effect of pressing down on inflation. So we look at all of those, starting with the first one. You can see we just talked about the housing market. The housing market is the classic part of the economy that's very sensitive to interest rates, and you're going to see a moderation in housing demand. You're going to see.
بحكي له إنه من أحد العوامل الأساسية إنه نخفض الطلب على البيوت وعلى السيارات عشان نخفض التضخم، يعني هذا هدفهم في الوقت الحالي، وبيحكي لك إنهم بدأوا يشوفوا انخفاض على الطلب في البيوت.
Financial markets are responding to the Fed's stance. I've consistently.
سألوا عن الأسواق.
Secretary Yellen, when you appear before the committee to talk about systemic risks, risk to financial stability, risk of financial contagion, where you're moving swiftly and markets are volatile, there are perhaps institutional trades that could rapidly unwind or exotic financial instruments that no longer function well. What do you anticipate to be the parts of capital markets now, or the phenomena in capital markets that present the greatest risk to financial stability as the Fed takes the aggressive action that you're taking?
أخي احكي مع اليوتيوب مش معي، هذا بث مباشر دائما في عندك، مش مني من يوتيوب.
Liquid does a much better job of understanding the risks it runs and managing them than before the global financial crisis, and that's a reflection of the work that regulators did and that the banks did too. So that part of the financial system is critically very strong, and we saw that through the pandemic, and we see it now. To your point, though, capital markets did show real periods of illiquidity during the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. And so we've been looking at ways, I say broadly, the regulatory community has been looking at ways to address that.
So you remain concerned about money markets?
Well, that's a different. So money markets that's a part of the economy which where it has become illiquid because the assets that they were invested in were not able to be turned into cash quickly to fund depositors wanting to take their money back. So we stepped in and had to provide that liquidity for the sector.
والله هيني بحاول أترجم الأمور المهمة جدا، وإن شاء الله أكيد يعني راح أتكلم أكيد.
And they're in the process of being considered and then implemented. So that should help on that front. I was thinking more of the Treasury market, for example, which it became illiquid when at the very beginning when people wanted nothing but cash, nothing but the cash and most cash-like things. Treasury market has been functioning though all through this period when we've very significantly changed the stance of monetary policy. So markets have been functioning. reasonably well, and
okay, my time's running short, and appreciate that. We'll probably follow up to talk a little bit more about financial risk. With my remaining few seconds, let me ask you this: how would you characterize the share of responsibility, if you will, on the supply side versus the demand side for the elevated price levels over the last year? To what extent do you believe that, you mentioned the supply curve being steeper than expected, and so the increased durable goods demand and consumer demand having a greater than expected effect on prices. Right now, is the principal driver of the increase in the price level elevated consumer demand, elevated demand, or is it supply constraints? I know we're facing both, but I'm asking you to allocate, as you can, some share to each phenomenon.
Yeah, I just would say it's clearly both factors are principally at work here. You couldn't get this kind of high.
هي هانت حتى لو صار هبوط يا ياسر، يعني أتصور إنه نهاية الدولار قربت، انعكاس الدولار قرب.
Both in the labor market reflected in high wages, and then in the goods market reflected in what's happened with durable goods and cars in particular. You look there. It's been driven by semiconductor shortage.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of the chair, Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Chairman Powell, thank you for your presence here today. Let me start just by making certain that I tell you something that I think I need to say on behalf of Kansans. I've never seen the level of anxiety, uncertainty, concern for the
بحكي له أنا بحياتي ما شفت اكتئاب وتشاؤم وخوف من يعني زي الوضع هيك.
neighborhood and across Kansas. Things not right. Inflation is a significant component of that feeling, and the inability to know what's around the corner is terribly damaging to folks, both financially but also mentally or psychologically. There's a real circumstance out there that I want you as the chairman and your colleagues to know exists. It is, I think, uncertainty and what the future holds is one of the most damaging things when people try to figure out their lives and how comfortable they are. I also want to highlight a particular Kansas, but middle America, across the country, issue of agriculture. I was on a farm on Saturday, participating in, observing harvest of wheat. We live in a world in which people are starving, and more are going to starve if we are unable to, if we fail to get more grain into markets from Ukraine and from Russia, but from the United States as well. Agriculture, farming is a noble calling, and it has a lot to do with being able to feed people who are now desperate. Part of the concern in regard to agriculture is the interest rates have a significant consequence to the profitability, to the survivability of producers, and profit margins get squeezed if interest rates continue to climb. We face declining or lower land values. That creates greater access to credit challenges. Tell me how you see, one, how I can assure my Kansans that and Americans that things are going to be better, and two, how can I assure farmers and ranchers that they're.
بحكي له كيف ممكن أطمن المواطنين الأمريكيين الوضع تمام، وكيف ممكن أطمن المزارعين إنه الأمور تمام وراح يحصلوا على الأعلاف وعلى السماد.
It's readings that we're reading about and your comments about Kansas citizens as being pretty directly related to high inflation. And I think people haven't seen it. You know, most people, you and I are old enough to remember what it was like. And it's, it's something that it just really does destroy public confidence in the economy and that kind of thing. So we need to get inflation back down to 2%. And all I can say is we're using our tools to do that. And
الحلو عنده كل الأسئلة عندها نفس الإجابة. بحكي له إن إحنا نستخدم الأدوات اللي عندنا عشان نرجع أو نخفض التضخم ل 2%. لكن مش معطي حلول، هو مش معطي حلول. طب خلص يعني مش فاهم أنا، مش معطي حلول.
They may remain high, but they're quite volatile over time. That's what the record shows. So we're doing what we can to get inflation down, the parts that we can address. So for whatever that's worth, that's what we can do and what we will do. In terms of the agricultural patch, as you know, we have, including your Kansas City Fed president, we have some terrific people who are Reserve Bank presidents who give us a good sense of what's going on in the agricultural sector on an ongoing basis. And it's obviously a very, very difficult time with fertilizer prices and difficulty in getting all kinds of inputs. And it's just a very challenging time in the agricultural world. We do understand that. Our part of it is to do what we can to get inflation back under control. I know higher interest rates are painful, but that's the tool we have to moderate demand and get demand and supply back into balance.
بحكي له صحيح إنه الفائدة مؤذية، لكن هذه الأداة الوحيدة اللي معانا عشان ننزل مستوى التضخم ونوقف الطلب أو نقلل الطلب.
One of them, I think you mentioned, was energy. Let me be reassured, if you would, that there will not be actions by the Federal Reserve to make lending to fossil fuel producers a component of the policies of the Federal Reserve. When you say you have little to do with it, you could cause great damage if you decide to go down a path that was at least contemplated by a number of nominees for the Federal Reserve Board. And I would love to be reassured that's not a component that you would pursue, and that we would not see resulting increasing a cost of fuel as a result of federal policy, Federal Reserve policy.
In my view, and I think the view of my view certainly is that it's not our job to allocate credit to or against or away from any particular sector of the economy. That's a job for elected officials or for markets, but it's not a job for the Federal Reserve, which has a mandate to, pursue maximum employment, price stability, a well-regulated banking system, and a sound payment system.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
لا الأمور خارج عن سيطرته واضحة جدا.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here again today. Georgia is in a serious housing crisis, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta has designated owning a home in Atlanta as unaffordable to the average home buyer. But it's not just a city problem.
والله الوضع صعب شكله في أمريكا. لا ما يهمهم حياة المواطن.
30,000.
ما يهمهم كله حكي فاضي.
Also rated as unaffordable. In the midst of this housing crisis, the Federal Reserve Bank, which has a tough mandate and a tough time of managing inflation, has raised the federal funds rate by 0.75%. This means mortgages are about to get a lot more expensive for families. Chairman Powell, as the Fed raises its interest rates, what is the Fed doing to prevent this rate increase from further exacerbating the housing crisis?
Well, so by raising rates, we're clearly what you're seeing is a slowing housing market now. You're seeing because of high.
بيحكي له هذا السيناتور بيحكي له إنه المواطنين في جورجيا بدأوا يعانوا من البيوت، يعني اللي بدأوا يعانوا من إنه توفير الأموال للبيوت. هو بيحكي له شو ممكن أنت تضمن عشان تخف الفائدة. بتعرف شباب بيحكي له هذا هو اللي أنت بتشوفه، اللي إحنا هدفنا إنه نخفف الطلب على البيوت، فبالتالي الأسعار رح ترخص أوتوماتيكي. هذا هو قصده، يعني إنه الانخفاض على الطلب أو عدم القدرة على شراء البيوت وعدم القدرة على دفع الأجار، هذا هو اللي راح يؤدي لخفض الأسعار.
Demand for housing moderates for new and existing homes. You should see prices stop going up quite so fast. You're also going to see
أما لسه ما فيش لا سلاح ولا إشي.
A lower rate of activity in the housing market. So really what needs to happen is housing supply and demand need to get back into better alignment. And the part of that we can control is really by moderating demand so that prices stop going up quite so much and that we can get back to a housing market where supply and demand are. Now, we don't control supply, and there are issues in this country around housing supply. It's harder to get land and lots and things like that. It's harder to get people to work. So there are supply side constraints. If you meet with builders from around the country, they will tell you that we have a longer term issue as a country around.
والله هيك شكلها راح تكمل الأزمة لحد ما يشوفوا انخفاض في التضخم.
But it is an important issue.
Right. Notwithstanding that, mortgages are clearly, at least in the short term, are about to get more expensive. And it seems to me that what would be helpful is if the Congress would pass my Down Payment Toward Equity Act to help first-generation home buyers afford their first home. What effects do you expect the Fed's interest rate increases will have on well, let me put it this another way. The Federal Reserve helps enforce the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. What plans do you have to ensure that as interest rates increase, everyone still has access to a fair...
نعم صحيح بيكون في خوف يا تايتن نعم. بالضبط يا براند هو تجهيز نفسي.
And so we'll continue to enforce those, transparently and aggressively. It is true though that mortgage rates have gone up, and that will slow down demand, and that will be there's some pain involved in that for people paying higher mortgage rates, and also some.
بحكي له صحيح انه القروض الان خفت والطلب على البيوت قل، واكيد هذا مؤلم لكثير من الناس، لكن هذا هو اللي بدنا نعمله.
People's wages aren't being eaten up by inflation. Right. So the greatest pain would be if we allow this high inflation to just continue.
الألم الأكبر إذا بنترك التضخم يصير، يعني هو بيحكي لك يعني شوف أنت بين نارين، بده يعطيك النار الأخف اللي هي نار إنه تتحمل شوي رفع في الأسعار تبعت الفائدة، لكن ما تتحملش النار تبعت ارتفاع الأسعار المستمرة.
When Secretary Yellen was here, she stated that the Federal Reserve needed to not only be skillful, but she said, quote, lucky to ensure, quote, a soft landing. I don't like counting on luck when the economic safety of Georgians, particularly those at the margins, is at risk, which is why I'm doing what I can here in the Senate. I've introduced a couple of bills to lower the price of gas, to lower the cost of groceries and other everyday goods, to cap the cost of insulin and other medication. And I've held the White House accountable to pursue investigation of price gouging of ocean carriers. And I've supported bipartisan legislation addressing the same issue that just became law. How can Congress lower costs for Georgia families? And what steps can Congress take to support the Fed and ensure a soft landing?
So I guess I'd be reluctant to give you advice while we're trying so hard to do the job that you've actually assigned us, which is to get inflation back down. But I think those are authorities that those of you who run for elected office have, and we don't have as mere appointees. So that's really up to you.
بحكي له شو هي الإجراءات اللي ممكن إحنا ناخدها كسيناتورز عشان نخفف الوضع الحالي على المواطنين، عشان تقدر تنجح بالهبوط الناعم. هم بيسموه هبوط ناعم، هو بيحكي له الهبوط الناعم هذا.
It's always the case, and in the case of inflation, it's really that if you're spending every dollar that you're intaking on the bare essentials of life, and the cost of them goes up 10%, you're in trouble right away.
Right.
Whereas middle class people and people better off than that, they've got some resources, some ability to deal with it. So that's why it's such a priority for us to get on top of inflation before it does become entrenched. Inflation's only now been around for, it really didn't start until March of last year. So it's not at all too late for us to get this job done and get back onto the kind of path we all want to be on.
Thank you so much. I'm concerned about this, and it's why in the meantime I've introduced several bills to lower the costs for essential items like gas and groceries.
ولا جاوب على ولا سؤال من الأسئلة اللي بدهم إياهم. هم بدهم حلول، لحد الآن هو مش معطيهم حلول، هو بيحكي له عن الإجراءات.
We'll join virtually.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for joining us today. And congratulations on your recent reconfirmation. The inflation numbers continue to be concerning, and this is the number one issue I've been hearing about from Arizonans. Families and small businesses are paying higher prices, and they need relief from soaring inflation so they can make ends meet. But we also know that this is not only a U.S. problem. Countries around the world, both big and small, are also seeing high inflation. So how is the U.S. position relative to other countries with respect to inflation?
تسألوا كيف وضع أمريكا مقارنة في الدول الثانية يعني لما نيجي بخصوص التضخم.
Economies, you saw Canada released their inflation number today. It's not far from where ours are. Same with the Western European democracies and the United Kingdom. But there are different compositions. So I would say to generalize, in the United States, our inflation has more of a demand-driven component, whereas in Europe it is more, to a greater extent, driven by very high energy prices, for example. Although in the United Kingdom kind of has a mix of both of those. We also have high energy prices here. So the levels are similar, but the composition is a little bit different here in the United States.
Well, thank you. You know, crypto markets have experienced substantial volatility in the past several weeks. Has the Fed been tracking these events, and what implications do they have for how the Fed is viewing the broader making decisions with respect to monetary policy?
We are tracking those events very carefully, of course, and not really seeing significant macroeconomic implications so far. And but I think the principal implication is really what we've been saying, and others have been saying for some time, which is that in this very innovative new space, really there's a need for a better regulatory framework that treats,
بيحكي عن التنظيم ومش تنظيم والمراقبة.
He should have the same regulation no matter where it appears, and that isn't the case right now because a lot of the digital finance products are in some ways quite similar to products that had existed in the banking system or the capital markets, but they're not regulated the same way. So we need to do that, and I think that is the main takeaway I would have.
يعني بالله عليك الواحد بيسمع لهاي الشخصية بدوش يروح علينا.
Proportion current U.S. inflation to assign to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and how are you thinking about these events in the context of setting monetary policy?
Well, I would say the increase in commodity prices are clearly connected to the war in Ukraine, and so that part of inflation would be certainly much lower.
نعم أخي راح يرفعوا الفائدة لا شك في رفع الفائدة قادم ما فيش توقف لرفع الفائدة لحد ما يوصلوا 3%.
Tools work on demand, and there's a job for our tools to do here. There is a job to moderate demand so that it can be in better balance with supply, but it wouldn't. We don't think that we have the answer to higher oil prices, due to the global oil situation.
I know the Fed tracks the core personal consumption expenditures index closely when thinking about monetary policy. Many trends in our economy, including a big shift towards technology and e-commerce, accelerated during the first year of the pandemic. And it's possible that the indicators and weights used to measure inflation may need to be revised to accurately measure inflation as Americans are experiencing it. So we all know inflation is high, but how high it is matters to ensure that we have an appropriate response.
لكن هو بيحكي لك إنه بدري يعني لسه نعمل تنظيم وهذا بس بيحكي إنه نعم من الأسواق اللي لازم يكون عليها تنظيم ومراقبة طبيعي.
Families and businesses are facing. Have you given thought to this issue?
Well, yes, in the sense that we look very carefully at the way we measure inflation in this country. We actually use personal consumption expenditures, which is a little different and a better approach, we think, than the more traditional consumer price index. This was a change we made about 20 years ago, and I think economists generally think that PCE inflation does.
والله شغله سهل طلع يعني ارفع الفائدة لما يطلع السعر ولا شو بيقبض له $20,000 بالأسبوع.
And we keep it updated. The government agency that manages it keeps it.
يعني هم موظفينه عشان يرفع الفائدة يعني طب يا عم أنت موظف عشان تلاقي حلول يعني ماشي ما هو أي واحد جيب جارنا أبو خليل الحلاق بيرفع الفائدة كل شهر ما عندوش مشكلة لكن بدنا حلول على أرض الواقع.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I see my time's expired. I yield back. Thank you.
Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, I want to start on the issue of diversity at the Fed. I have a letter that we sent you yesterday and signed by 9 senators, including 5 members of this committee, urging you to undertake a number of simple reforms to the process for selecting bank presidents and Class B directors. That process has to include meaningful transparency and public engagement. if we are ever going to have Fed leadership that truly represents
مش فاهم يا أخي يا رب شو أبو ما فعلته
the Federal Reserve Act.
ما فهمتش السؤال.
So I'll wait for your written response, because we just sent that letter, on the details of those proposed reforms. But for now, can I have your commitment that you'll provide us with a substantive response by July the 22nd?
Yes.
Thank you. And also, will you commit to work with me to put in place real, meaningful changes to the process so we can have a broader array of voices to the Fed leadership?
I'll commit to having a frank discussion with you about that and what could be. We're open to ideas to how to improve. As you point out in your letter, it's not like we haven't made tremendous strides as it relates to the B and C directors in the course of the last 10 years. We really have. And the diversity numbers are, I think, quite impressive for the B and C directors. The A directors, as you point out in your letter, less so, but those are appointed by the bankers in the district. But we can have this conversation. I look forward to it.
Less so, but it's worse than less so. I mean, you don't have one bank president in the history of the Federal Reserve who's been Hispanic. That's
بحكي له انه لازم نحط اعضاء جدد، لازم نوسع شوي القاعده او الاعضاء تبعون البنك الفدرالي.
And there was a tremendous opportunity and it didn't happen. I just continue, I feel like I'm the lone effort on this, but 62 million Hispanic Americans who represent $2 trillion of domestic purchasing power deserve a seat at where some of the most important economic decisions are being made. So we look forward to the engagement that you've said that you're willing to engage in. Now, I am trying to find out, as others have raised with you, there's no question that painfully high inflation is affecting every family in America. But in order to develop the right response, we need to understand the underlying factors that are driving price increases. I think you've said here today
في مؤثرات أخرى على الارتفاع الأسعار.
Related supply chain issues are perhaps
خطوط التمديد
that flow from Russia's invasion of Ukraine are perhaps some of the biggest factors in driving inflation. But the question is, how is it that raising interest rates on those underlying causes of today's inflation
بحكي له كيف رفع الفائدة على هذه المؤثرات الخارجية اللي هي الحرب وانقطاع خطوط الإمداد من السلع الغذائية راح تأثر على خفض السعر بما إنه المؤثرات خارجية. هذا سؤال مهم جدا من لحد الآن مش مجاوب عليه هو.
Interest rates that's going to affect any of that.
وعليكم السلام.
No, but notwithstanding that, there are major parts of the economy where the demand exceeds supply meaningfully, and that's where our tools have a job to do, where we can moderate demand and give supply time to recover so that supply and demand get back into better balance and inflation comes down.
Well, it seems to me that we can all recognize that raising interest rates is a blunt tool at the end of the day. But I'm going back to the beginning of my questioning, it's essential, I believe, to be mindful of the effects that your actions, meaning the Federal Reserve, will have on unemployment, particularly for those groups that were hit hardest by the pandemic. The Fed's latest monetary policy report states that, quote, employment for blacks and Hispanics not only declined by more than that for whites and Asians early in the pandemic, but also recovered more quickly since the end of last year. Now that we're potentially entering a period of larger and more frequent interest rate increases, what do you expect will happen to the unemployment rates of black and Hispanic workers relative to the population as a whole?
Well, it'll depend on what happens to the overall unemployment rate. And our goal is to achieve 2% inflation while still keeping the labor market strong. That's our intention with this.
Well, I appreciate what your intention is, but I would venture to say that what we will see is what we have seen in the past, that crisis after crisis disproportionately harms Americans of color. So I hope the Fed's response to inflation doesn't continue that trend, because it is woefully wrong that one group of Americans disproportionately faces consequences of policy decisions versus the rest of America. And this is another reason to have people at the Federal Reserve who represent this community to share those insights with the.
بحكي له عن الأقليات إنه هي اللي بتعاني حاليا من الرفع المستمر للفائدة، ومش عدل إنه أقليات تعاني والأقليات الثانية تعاني لحساب أقليات ثانية. هو قصده إنه البيض هم المستفيدين والمكسيكان والسود هم المتأثرين.
And a question from Senator Sinema. Senator Warner more or less asserted that we're all in the same boat in terms of inflation globally, but you made the point on two different occasions that what's driving inflation in largely Europe, a little bit less so in the UK, has to do with spiraling energy prices. Could you talk a little bit about, beyond the pain at the gas pump and the increased cost of transportation, how increasing, and I should say, and I believe that Europe is where they are, this is not for you to comment on, because they moved a little bit too aggressively and didn't look at resiliency with some of their energy inputs that were largely affected by the Russia invasion. But could you talk a little bit about the other commodities that are affected by rising interest rates? We're talking about housing, and we know that pipes, a number of inputs to housing construction, have gone up. Can you talk a little bit more about the market basket of other commodities that are influenced by increasing energy prices?
I think energy prices go into an awful lot of different places in the economy, including, as an input into manufactured goods of all kinds, and plastics particularly, and things like that. So it's a big contributor to inflation, not beyond just the actual energy prices.
Yeah, and so my only comment here, and then I just have a closing thought, is that we are unilaterally hamstringing your ability to bring inflation down. You don't have to respond to this. It's a policy position. By artificially increasing the cost of energy in this country. If we simply would recognize that there is a way to get to a transition to green renewable energy and make the glide path sustainable, we could easily separate ourselves from the rest of other Western democracies with respect to that tool, which is not in your toolbox. And hopefully we can get to that discussion and embrace the idea that the transition is inevitable. It's a matter.
بحكي له عن موضوع الطاقة البترول، إنه بما إنها مش في إيدك، مش من الأدوات اللي موجودة عندك، هل ممكن الاتجاه للطاقة النظيفة، يعني إنه يحل هذه المشكلة، ولازم نتجه لهذا الاتجاه. هلا هو بيحكي له هذا مقترح، ما تجاوبش عليه كسؤال يعني.
Review based on the circumstances as you see them today. In other words, would that be something potentially on the table with the measures that you are?
بنصوت لك يا واحفظها، رفع الفائدة 45 نقطة 75 نقطة.
Take something off the table for any and all purposes. The committee that I chair will make whatever moves it believes are appropriate to restore price stability.
Okay. Well, I for one, am glad you're at the helm. I have a lot of confidence in you, which is why I voted for your confirmation. But we will be submitting some questions to the record back on the points that I made in the opening statement about transparency. There is some frustration, and I have to say it's bipartisan in terms of questions that we're asking and not getting answers to. The master account is one of them, but there are other items that we'll just include for the record. Thank you, Chair Powell. Thank you for serving.
Thank you, Senator Tillerson. Thank you for your cooperation in this hearing today, and a busy day for a lot of people. And Senator and Chair Powell, thank you. I have a series of questions. I have not asked my questions. I was saving them for last. But then after my questions, we'll adjourn. You said that Russia's aggression in Ukraine, port congestion, and COVID lockdowns in China especially have contributed to higher prices. Consumer spending continues to be strong. Most Americans probably worry about inflation. Talk for a moment, if you would, about the strengths of the American economy now and whether or not you see positive signs of prices stabilizing.
Well,
بحكي له تحدث عن الاقتصاد الأمريكي وهل بتشوف استقرار في الأسعار حاليا؟
Consumer, but overall the consumer sector is in very strong shape financially. There's, as you know, a very substantial accumulated quantity of savings on balance sheets. less so at the very bottom of the income spectrum, but right across the rest of the spectrum. And so that's there to support spending even in the face of higher inflation. And you're seeing consumer spending hold up pretty well. Sorry, the rest of your question.
Well, are there positive signs of prices stabilizing?
So in terms of prices stabilizing, what we're looking for is compelling evidence that inflation is coming down, and we don't have that. So nothing I could point to says that we have that. I will say that core PCE inflation is a pretty good indicator of where underlying inflation is running, and it has moderated over the course of this year reasonably significantly from where it was in the latter part of last year. Still way higher than it needs to be. We need to see a lot more progress. But just it's been running at a rate over the last, say, four or 5 months that is lower than it was, at least. But again, still far too high. So we're looking for that. We're not really seeing it yet. There are lots of stories out there of how this should happen, and some people think it's very clear that it will. And until we actually do see it happen, we need to keep moving.
And I want to be clear from your comments publicly, your comments to this committee today. You say the economy is not at the point of a recession, correct?
I don't see the likelihood of a recession as particularly elevated right.
سألوا أنت مش شايف إنه البلد متوجه للركود بحكي له مش شايف.
Very good at forecasting recessions. Very far out. We just no one's been able to do that regularly. But I would say that the U.S. economy for now is strong, and
شكلنا في وضع محزن لأنه بحكي له الوضع اقتصادي جيد.
Clearly, financial conditions have tightened, and you're seeing growth slow from the very elevated levels of last year associated with the reopening. You're seeing the beginnings of job growth slowing to more sustainable levels. And there's risk in that. There's obviously risk in that. Monetary policy is famously a blunt tool, and there's risk that weaker outcomes are certainly possible, but they're not our intent.
And as I said at the beginning of my testimony, or my opening statement, that a couple hours ago, that our economy is growing faster than China's. Let me ask a few simple questions about gas prices. We've heard a lot today about gas prices from both sides. Just a few yes or no's. Does President Biden set gas prices?
No.
Does Congress set gas prices?
Not as far as I know.
Do you, as chair of the Federal Reserve, set gas prices?
No.
I wouldn't ask you to assign a sort of quantum responsibility, but starting with the decisions of OPEC and the world's major oil companies to not produce more, can you tell the committee briefly what goes into the price at the pump, and ultimately what tools you have, Congress has, other government agencies have to bring the price down?
It's really principally the price of oil, which is set globally by the actions of largely by the actions of large oil-producing countries, and then it's the refining spread, what it costs to refine, what the refiners can charge before the public consumes that refined product. So those are the two pieces of it, and we
يسألوا مين بحدد أسعار البترول؟ هل الرئيس الأمريكي؟ هل نحن؟ هل أنت؟ بحكي له لا المؤثرات الخارجية.
What about housing? Several have asked about the skyrocketing costs for both renters and aspiring homeowners. Prices over the last 2 years, but prices weren't that great prior to President Biden and the last administration either, we know. Last year alone, rents went up more than 11%, grew faster than wages. What are the short-term and long-term effects on inflation in our economy if renters see more and more of their monthly income going to housing?
Well, that will crowd out other kinds of spending, and that's the very fast increases in housing prices over the last couple of years have been very broad across the country and unsustainably high.
And that, of course, speaks to the importance of building more housing. Last question I want to ask before adjournment. We've seen cryptocurrency values collapse by some $2 trillion in markets crash over the past few weeks, consumers losing money, workers losing jobs. The Monetary Policy Report highlighted the risks of stable coins, digital assets that aim to maintain a stable value in order to trade crypto.
سألوا عن انهيار الكريبتو يا اخوان.
If you would, about the financial stability and monetary policy risks that these assets pose, and how are stable coins different? In your answer, include how stable coins are different from the U.S. dollar, which has the full faith and credit of the United States behind it.
A stable coin is an instrument really that is backed up in it. There's a reserve that has securities in it that are meant to assure the value of that of what's, let's say it's $1 stable coin. So it's meant to assure that your interest is actually worth $1. So that sounds a lot like a money market fund, for example. And the way money market funds work is there's great transparency about what's in the reserve and their requirements about what must be in the reserve in order to preserve that $1 value. The world of stable coins is new and emerging, and it doesn't have the sort of fit-for-purpose regulatory scheme that it needs to. And I think that's something you've been hearing a lot across the board from a number of federal agencies and from our own Treasury Department, which has been leading an effort to try to put in place. And many members of Congress now have proposed new frameworks for regulating stablecoins and digital assets generally, and that seems like a wise thing.
And you don't, clearly SEC, clearly CFPB, other agencies, the Fed's role in regulation of cryptocurrency, in your mind, is what?
Well, that's one of the issues, is who really does have authority over this, and that's something Congress would need to clarify. We have authority over what banks can and can't do, some banks and bank holding companies. The SEC has some jurisdiction over securities. The CFTC has relevant jurisdiction. So part of this will be sorting out, deciding what these things are and how they should be regulated. There are stable coins that are really used in connection with the crypto trading platforms. That's most of what happens now with stable coins, but there are also some stable coins and even more potentially that will be used in payments broadly. So that would be two different kinds of regulation there. It's just an area where Congress Congress is investing bandwidth and looking at proposals and something like that. And that's, I think, a healthy process that should lead over time to something that has bipartisan support and puts in place appropriate regulation for the whole area.
Let me drill down for then my last question. What if Congress doesn't act on? I understand that the Commodities Future Trading Commission understand what you said about SEC. Is the Fed directly involved in any of these regulatory actions regarding cryptocurrency, absent Congress action?
We regulate banks, regulate and supervise banks. And so we have a say in what our banks, the Federal Reserve regulated banks and bank holding companies do with crypto assets on their balance sheets, what activities are permitted and that kind of thing.
Does that
of course,
suggest,
the OCC is at that table, and so is the FDIC.
Does that suggest that a number of American banks are cautious because of your oversight of them on crypto?
I mean, American banks are are now very much exploring, are there profitable opportunities to serve our customers in this new space? And of course, what we're doing is saying, let's be sure that takes place in a way that preserves and supports safety and soundness. And we've had a ongoing set of meetings and collaborations with the FDIC and the OCC. And that's ongoing, I guess, between us and the OCC. So I think that's an appropriate way to carry it forward. But it's not a substitute for what I think is, it's not like it's like any other major area of innovation. Ultimately, Congress will come together to create a regulatory framework that is more fit for purpose for it, as it has in so many other cases.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair Powell. I look forward to continue working together. For senators who wish to submit questions, those questions are due 1 week from today, Wednesday, June 29th. To Chair Powell, please submit your responses to these questions for the record for no more than 45 days.
And so concludes today's hearing before the Senate Banking Committee. We've been listening there to Sherrod Brown, the chair of that committee. We've heard Fed Chair Jay Powell testify here for some long time about what's going on with the economy overall. He started right out at the beginning and said that at this point he anticipates further rate increases, although he was not very specific about when or how many, but further rate increases so that they can really adhere to the mandate of Congress to ensure stable prices at a time of real inflation. At the same time, Chair Powell was very careful to say he thinks the economy is strong in many respects and he thinks it can withstand it. When asked directly about the possibility of recession, he said that it was a possibility. He allowed us how it was a possibility, but at this point he does not see the chances of that as elevated and certainly doesn't see it as inevitable. To take us through what he heard in this testimony, we welcome now Michael McKee. He's Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. So, Mike, what did we learn today?
Not a whole lot. And if investors were expecting the chairman to lay out much more detail on a path for interest rates, they've got to be disappointed. At the very end of the hearing, Chairman Sherrod Brown asked him about the possibility of a 1% move. And he said they don't anticipate it, but he's not ruling it out. That may be the most informative remark he made all day. He also said that the Fed is going to have a tough time getting to a soft landing, but they think they can do it. And as you mentioned, recession isn't imminent, he suggested. It is a possibility rather than imminent. Higher rates are painful. He admitted that. And they said there is not much more the Fed can do because that's its toolbox is higher interest rates at this point. He said the Fed is going to try to bring down the rate of wage increases, but not bring down wages. Their goal is to cool the economy and not destroy demand. Pretty straightforward hearing, David. There wasn't a lot of questions. There weren't a lot of questions that would satisfy people on Wall Street, but there were a lot of political questions, of course, about this program or that program that he might support or who is at fault for this or that. And as usual, he ducked answering those questions.
Yeah, just for our audience.
حتى هذا المحلل بيحكي انه هو اصلا تجنب الاجابه على كل هاي الاسئله.
The NASDAQ is up less than 0.25%. The S&P 500 is up almost just 0.10%, very just slightly up. As the bond market, on the other hand, though, really the 10-year has been on a buy. It's up, about 11 basis points. The yield is down about 11 basis points now. So Mike, take us back through neutral rate, 2.5%. He's clinging to that position that that's the neutral rate. But he did seem to say he does think they have to go above it.
Yeah, the neutral rate is hard to know until you get there and look back at it. But their view has always been that long term it would be about 2.5%. They've admitted they're going to need to go higher than that. And if you look at the dot plot from last week, it goes up to about 3.86% at the end of next year. So that would put them well above what they consider their long run neutral rate. And then
live.
It's down again. And you see that priced into the markets. So at this point, the markets are expecting a higher rate going forward, and then they expect it to come back down again. There's the dot plot that suggests over the next 2023, we see a peak, and then it comes down again.
متوقعين انه ترتفع في عام 2023 وتبدا بالانخفاض من عام 2024 ل 25. يلا هاند يا شباب 5 سنين.
Is going down. We've seen declines in new home sales and existing home sales the past couple of months.
هذا هو كل شيء، هذا هو يا اخوان. يعني ما طلعش بحلول، وعلى ما يبدو الاشي المؤكد هينا يعني كل شيء مؤكد. رفع سعر الفائدة راح يستمر، انتظار التضخم يعني ما فيش بيد حيلة الآن للأسف. ما فيش حتى حدا، مش شايف أنا ناس بتحكي عنهم يعني.
I would say first of all, DeFi is spectacular and that will be NFTs. And
هذا هو كل الأخبار يا أخوان. هاي يعني هلا بدنا نستنى نشوف ردة فعل السوق. الدولار كأنه عاد. شو رأيكم يا أخوان؟ شو رأيكم؟ راح نصبر كثير؟ هلا ناجي. لا والله كان في جلسة للكونغرس الأمريكي، تحقيق مش تحقيق، يعني زي جلسة حديث مع جيروم. واقف الستيكينج على بلوكتوبيا، ما تصورش. رأيكم بنشوف مرحلة استسلام ثانية؟ نعم أخي مسكر. نعم نعم أخي مسكر كل شيء، كله closed. نعم أخي موقف حاليا. البيتكوين هبط. يلا لمصلحتنا إذا كمل هبوط. $19,800. يلا هو اصلا احنا ما شفناش الفوليوم اللي حكينا خلص الهبوط. الدولار شكله راح يطلع ولا ايش لعند هاي المنطقة، بعدها يهبط ان شاء الله. ان شاء الله يكون الاغلاق الاسبوعي سلبي، لانه لحد الان الشمعة ما شاء الله سلبية. نعم اغلب العملات مش بس البيتكوين، اثيريوم، كله اغلبهم الان حاليا ممكن نزول. ممكن في عندك رفع فائدة مرتين ثلاثة وبعدها خلص اتصور. اكيد يا عرب، اكيد ما فيش حل يعني حاليا، الا اذا بدك تطلع من السوق انت حر. لكن انا بشوف انه يعني ما فيش حل غير انه الواحد يصبر يعني، او خلص يضل في السوق. يعني انا يعني انت طبيعي، انت شو بتعمل في السوق يعني. زيرو فيز تريدينج باينانس. ما فيش حدا جايب. ما فيش ولا اي حدا جايب سيرة السوق لحد الان. طيب عندنا مجال ال 24 كل وقت شراء. والله هذه هي عراقي للنخاع. انا يعني بالنسبه لي مش راح اوقف يعني. الفرصه هذه فرصه عمر. يعني تخيل انت واحد يجي يحكي لك الامور راح تسوء من هنا لسنه، ولا راح نضلنا نفس ما هي. تخيل المشاريع القويه اللي راح تصمد من هنا لسنه تضلك تستثمر فيها وتروح تطلع بول ماركت كبير. يعني معناها انت ممكن انت الان امام فرصه خلال عام 2025 او 24 تكون مستقيل من كل شيء يعني رسمي. انا بالنسبه لي عندي احلام اكيد اشتري بيتي، يكون عندي ملكي، فهمت علي؟ لانه ما بقدر اخذ قرض، ففي عندي احلام اكيد اني اشتري بيت ملك الي وخلص يعني ارتاح من موضوع البيت. ففي ان شاء الله هذه الفرصه باذن الواحد الاحد، هذه الفرصه القادمه واللي ممكن تكون يعني خلص يعني بكفي. شو موجز الجلسة؟ والله الموجز انه موضوع الركود الاقتصادي اللي هو اللي مخوف الكونغرس الامريكي. فسألوا انه هل في ضمانات؟ ما فيش ضمانات للاسف. بيحكي لهم انه الركود هذا ما فيش منه مهرب، لكن عندنا الاجراءات المهمة انه نخفض التضخم عن طريق تقليل الطلب. تقليل الطلب بيكون عن طريق رفع الفائدة، فبالتالي بترتفع الاسعار بترتفع الاسعار والطلب بقل. بين 11,000 و 40,000 هل إذا استمر التضخم هل سيستمر برفع الفائدة؟ لا مش راح آخر شيء آخر حده 3.5. ما فيش عمولة على التداول. نعم هذا المكتوب من بس ممكن اليو اس أخي ما بعرفش شو والله. يو اس أخي يو اس بس الأمريكية. بس المنصة الأمريكية بالضبط يا فراس بالضبط. وفي عندنا مشاريع الحمد لله هي أنا شايف إنه هذه فرصة يا إخواني، هذه فرصة يا إخوان راح تيجي. الوضع الاقتصادي راح يتحسن، وإحنا عندنا معلومات الآن إنه راح يتحسن، وحتى ممكن يعني الأمور تتحسن يعني حتى إخواني يعني الموضوع مش راح يضل للأبد يعني حتى ممكن هو يوصل أول ما يوصل 2.5% نبدأ نشوف ضعف، نبدأ نشوف توقف بالتضخم. فطبيعي انه نشوف هبوط. يعني احنا تقريبا الان تجاوزنا 90% او 80% من المرحله الصعبه. فتخيل انت واحد يجي يحكي لك انه هل انت مستعد تصبر سنتين وتغير حياتك؟ سنتين. والناس ممكن تصبر 25 سنه في وظيفه عشان يدوب يتقاعد وراتب مش مكفيه. طب يا اخي ما هو هلا الواحد ممكن يستثمر 1500 ويعمل ستاك او ما يعملش ستاك. يعني فهمت علي؟ في كثير فرص الان. انا ان شاء الله باذن الواحد الاحد خلال يعني البول ماركت القادم باذن الله راح يكون التقاعد يعني باذن الله الكامل. يعني البيت والدنيا وكلها الواحد خلص. لكن هسه بدنا نستغل ان شاء الله الفرصه. شو رايك باي ام اكس؟ لا هو ملهاش علاقه بالسعر الحالي كمشروع. نعم ممتاز جدا مشروع اي ام اكس ممتاز من المشاريع الناجحه والواعده ان شاء الله. وانا اصلا مركز عليه عشان هو على كوين بيس. يعني الدولار لازم يصحح. يعني ما فيش حل يعني عنده. على اليوم ضعيف الإقبال، على الأسبوعي كمان أيضا ضعيف. نشوف كيف راح تكون الأمور. هلا بدنا نستفيد من علمك في الكرتون. إلك سكايب كرتون إيش يا عزيزي؟ شو الكرتون يعني؟ إن شاء الله أتوقع راح يروح ل 15,000 و 13,000. هو مش بعيد أصلا وصل ل 17,000. شيليز أخي لا مش مناسب إلي أنا شخصيا صراحة. وش الطريقة أخي الكريم ممكن نعمل ستاكينج؟ نعم أخي حمل المحفظة. أنا عامل فيديو كامل أخي عن الستاكينج لعملة مينا. إن شاء الله راح يفيدك الموضوع. راح تلاقيه عندي هنا في القناة في شرح كامل عن حنشوف نزول ثاني. أخي اللقاء ملوش علاقة بالنزول والصعود، لا نهائيا ما تفكرش هذا التفكير. الموضوع له أكثر علاقة بموضوع شو هي الإجراءات اللي راح ياخذها البنك الفدرالي. ايش هي الاجراءات اللي راح ياخذها البنك الفدرالي انها تضمن انه ما ندخلش في ركود. لكن الموضوع ملوش علاقه نهائيا. الاسواق نعم راح تضلها متاثره لانه لحد الان الاتجاه العام للاسواق العالميه الهبوط لحد الان. ما فيش اي مؤشرات على انعكاس، وطبيعي على الفتره القصيره ما فيش، لانه الدولار مش راح يعني يعطينا اتجاه مؤكد غير لما يتجه، يعني لما يصير في عندنا اتجاه. مهما تأخر البول ماركت قادم. لا شك يا نبهان، لا شك البول ماركت قادم على كل شيء، لأنه راح توصل الأسعار لمنطقة المدراء تبعت الصناديق والمستثمرين راح يبدأوا يشوفوها مناسبة، إن كان في الكريبتو أو إن كان في الأسواق العالمية. يعني هل ممكن في الوقت القادم إلقاء الضوء على المشاريع القوية لعمل بورتفوليو إن شاء الله أخي إن شاء الله. كي اس سي كيو كوين نظرتك على عملة؟ والله ما أعرف أخي، كل المنصات اللي بتعطي قروض ما بتتبعها أخي. حبيبي يا مصطفى الله يبارك فيك أخويا حبيبي الله يسعدك. علي بتعرف شيء عملات فينا نعملها تعدين مجاني؟ لا والله يا جايسون لا للأسف. ما رأيك في الاحتفاظ بالبيتكوين حاليا لحين ارتفاع الاستحواذ وشراء؟ والله ممكن، وطول ما هبط الاستحواذ كل ما كان جيد الشراء تبع البيتكوين. كيفية الحصول على واكس من الموقع تبعهم أخي، من الموقع نفسه. اذا استمرنا نشتري ايثيريوم ب 300 والبي ان بي ب 50، والله انا بهتم في الايثيريوم مقطع، مش في البي ان بي، لانه الايثيريوم راح تكون اتجاهها زي اتجاه البيتكوين، راح توصل قيمتها السوقيه المره الجايه ل 500 مليار. blockade reduced every 3 months and now it's closed. نعم will be opened again. بلوكتوب يا شباب بيعمل استاك كل 3 اشهر، وراح ينفتح ان شاء الله بشهر 9. مرحبا اخي علي، هسه جيت والله شوي تبعنا جلسة الكونغرس مع مدير البنك الفدرالي، وعلى ما يبدو انه في خوف من الكونغرس الامريكي بموضوع الدخول على ركود، فحبوا يتاكدوا منه. بس انا اتصور انه كل هذه تمثيليه يا اخواني. يعني ممكن نحكي انه ممكن هل بيخلوا الامريكان يستعدوا لركود؟ نعم ممكن، احتمال كبير باذن الله اخي ابو رضا، باذن الواحد الاحد اتصور سنه ونبدا نشوف يعني تحسنات بالسوق. يعني انا مش بحكي لك من هلا السنه، لا ممكن خلال السنه القادمه انه نشوف بول ماركت ان شاء الله. يعني اقل من سنه راح نكون في بول ماركت، يعني اتصور 1,000,000%. بحاول يا اخي مايوه، بحاول باذن الله باذن الله، لانه انا عندي البرنامج على الجهاز الثاني، فهمت علي؟ والجهاز الثاني ما عنديش عليه اني بقدر اعمل عليه فيديوهات نهائيا. الدولار شوي يعني مش مأكد، بدنا نشوف هسه الايام القادمه. هلا السؤال كالاتي: هل اذا بدانا نشوف انخفاض في التضخم وانخفضت نسبه العموله اللي هي الفائده، هل ممكن نبدا نشوف تحسن في الاسواق؟ نعم ممكن، احتمال كبير، خصوصا اذا ما راح دخلنا في مرحله كابيتوليشن اخرى. امتى راح يتحسن صعوبه التعدين على الاثيريوم برايك؟ لا اخي، هي بروف اوف ستاك اخي، بروف اوف ستاك، ما لهاش علاقه بالصعوبه، ما فيش صعوبه. شو حكيت على باينانس امريكي ما انتهى؟ ممكن تعيد؟ انه التداول عليها مجاني اخي، العموله مجانيه. وعليكم السلام اخي ابو فيصل. جي اس تي عملات بلاي تو ان ودور الصين، لا ما اعرف والله. البيع بهذه البيع بهذه الاسعار للشراء من الاسفل شيء جيد، والله شيء جيد اذا قدرت تعملها اخي، اذا قدرت تعملها ليش لا؟ يعني تبارك الرحمن. وعليكم السلام. اذا بتقدر تعمل هاي الحركه دائما وبتتوقع وبتعرف شو تعمل، اكيد ليش لا؟ يعني اذا بتصيد اسعار اقل ممتاز. انا بفضل انه وقت الصعود الواحد يطلع وينتظر تصحيح، اما مش البيع اثناء الهبوط وانتظار هبوط اخر. مريا والله هذا هو اللي انا بعمله يا يعقوب. يعني انا بتصور انه الاستثمار في الوضع المحرج هو افضل شيء، يعني اكيد افضل شيء، خصوصا اذا بتشتري اثناء الهبوط، يعني اثناء الهبوط وليس اثناء الاستقرار. اثناء الهبوط الحاد احيانا، يعني مثلا اللي صار المره اللي فاتت لما الناس شرت عند مناطق ال 17,000 كان في هبوط حاد، هذه المناطق كويسه جيده، فهمت علي؟ الاكيوميليشن هو اكيد استعد، ليش لا اخي استعد. يور بورتفوليو ان كريبتو، والله انا عندي البيتكوين هي المستحوذه اخي، يعني بشكل رئيسي، وبعدها بيجي عندك عملات جانبيه. لكن ممكن تطلع على عملات مثل اي ام اكس، مثل مينا، مثل بي واي ار، مثل كي دي اي، مثل واكس. هذه المشاريع كلها قويه اخي، ممكن تعدلنا 3 نسمي فيها غير بيتكوين وايثر. والله هم هدول المشاريع اخي، عندك اي ام اكس، عندك مينا، عندك كي دي اي، بي واي ار، اي سي بي، عندك واكس. يعني هذه مشاريع جدا جيده. متى نبدا يا غالي ندخل فلوس نشتري؟ لما يكون مناسب لك اخي، لما يكون مناسب لك. انا ما بقدر احكي لك شو تعمل، لانه انت هيك شفت يعني لحد الان متوقع انهم يرفعوا سعر الفائده، الاتجاه ليس صاعد، فهذه مشكلة كبيرة جدا، لأنه لحد الآن في عندنا احتمالية الهبوط. هل أنت مستعد تتحمل الهبوط؟ أنا بحكي لك من عندي هسه، إذا أنت ما بتقدر تحط مبلغ بسيط كل فترة، بنصحك ما تدخلش، بنصحك ما تدخلش غير لما تتأكد من أنت صاعد. مؤشرات الصعود لحد الآن مش موجودة. أبو إسراء، وضع الدول إذا ما استقر مشكلة الصين وأمريكا من أجل تايوان وروسيا وأوروبا، ولا أوروبا قامت تفتيش السيارات؟ ما بعرفش إيش هذه القصة والله. وإيش ملخص الاجتماع؟ انه الكونغرس الامريكي خايف من تضخم اخي، وبيحاولوا ياخذوا ضمانات من البنك الفدرالي انه مش راح يدخلوهم في ركود في الوضع الحالي مع الارتفاع المستمر في نسبة الفائدة والتضخم المستمر. لكن على ما يبدو انه جيروم باول ما عندوش اي حل نهائيا غير الاستمرار في رفع الفائدة اللي ممكن يؤدي لركود، وحكى انه نعم الركود احتمال من الاحتمالات، لكن هذا هو افضل الاحتمالات عندنا. يعني انت في عندك بين نارين، هذه افضل النيران، يعني الركود افضل من التضخم، الركود افضل من الاستمرار في التضخم. هذا كل الملخص يا اخوان، وان شاء الله احنا راح نتابع الاسواق ونشوف شو هي الامور. وانا بس حبيت يعني اشارك معاكم البث المباشر لانه كنت اتابعه على البث، فكنت حكيت وانا بتابعه. ان شاء الله بتكلم معاكم وبشوف شو هي الامور، اذا كان في عندنا امور مهمه اخذنا اللي بدنا اياه، اخذنا الكلام اللي بدنا اياه، وان شاء الله يا اخواني نتابع. يعني هيكم على امل انه يعني ان شاء الله الامور تنتهي، لكن اكيد راح لازم نتابع ضروري. فنعم ليش لا، الواحد يستعد ان شاء الله في افضل كميه ممكنه، استعداد للاستثمار. اللي بيقدر يستثمر، انا ما بحكي لك لا، لكن كمان ايضا الواحد لازم ياخذ في عين الاعتبار انه المرحله الحاليه مرحله صعبه. يعني لحد الان بما انه الامور لسه مش مؤكده، ان كان الهبوط تبع الدولار، ان كان صعود البيتكوين، ان كان عدم تطمينات البنك الفدرالي من دخول في ركود، يعني الامور غير واضحه. وكمان ايضا التهديد برفع مستمر للفائده، هذا كله اكيد راح ياثر سلبي على الاسواق. افضل عملات المضاربه اليوميه ما اعرف والله يا اخي، بقصد صعوبه تعدين. اخي انت قصدك الانتقال لبروف اوف ستاك؟ لا، هم الان في مرحله التست، فان شاء الله من هلا لنهايه العام راح ينتقلوا بشكل كامل. فبتحتاج 32 ايثيريوم اذا بدك تعمل نود، لكن ممكن تنضم لاشخاص اخرين حتى بواحد ايثيريوم، بتاخذ نسبه قليله جدا 4% اخي ولا 5%، مش مبلغ كبير جدا صراحه. يعني مش عائد، مش عائد ضخم يعني، اوعى تفكر انه عائد ضخم. الله يجيب اللي فيه الخير. احنا الان ان شاء الله بنتبع الدولار وكمان ايضا البيتكوين ونشوف كيف الامور. خصوصا الاغلاق الاسبوعي يا اخواني مهم جدا. يعني احنا الان عندنا وينزداي، عندنا ثيرزداي، فرايداي، يوم الاربعاء يوم الجمعه ان شاء الله بعد يومين راح نتاكد انه هل الدولار الامريكي سلبي، لانه اذا اغلق الدولار الامريكي سلبي اتوقعوا يعني ايجابيه ان شاء الله للكريبتو. الله يبارك فيكم، وإن شاء الله أنا معاكم يا إخواني. فإن شاء الله يا إخوان ألقاكم المرة القادمة يعني بأمور خير. لكن إحنا الآن عارفين وين الأسواق متجهة، حاسبين حسابها، مستعدين ماديا نفسيا إن شاء الله. وما تنسوش إنه الموضوع يعني بإذن الواحد الأحد سنة سنتين يا إخواني ماكس ماكس ماكس، يعني يا إما بعد سنتين بنكون في نهاية البول ماركت وبير ماركت جديد. يعني خلص ما أتصورش إنه من هلا لسنتين تنطلع في بول ماركت، لا مستحيل مستحيل، لأنه هو اقترب من هدفه. يعني المرة القادمة إذا طلعنا فوق مناطق 2.5%، فهمت علي، والشهر اللي بعديه وصل 3 وبدأنا نشوف انخفاض في التضخم، اتصور انه بعض الاسواق تبدأ تنتعش ان شاء الله. هل هناك هبوط قادم لكوزاما؟ اكيد اذا كملت البيتكوين هبوط اخي راح تكمل طبيعي، يعني ما لهاش علاقه بالترند. هي ما حداش بيقدر يضمن نجاح العمله او فشلها اخي في منطقه معينه. لكن هيك شايف انت موضوع الاستثمار مش فقط ترند، لا موضوع الاستثمار فيه مؤثرات خارجيه واحنا حكينا عنها الان بنتابعها بحذافيرها يعني. والله يا يعقوب بدي احاول ان شاء الله، لكن حاليا شوي بدي تعرف لسه ما اكلتش كويس، وكنت جاي من الشغل اصلا. انا يعني كنت عندي شغل ودي خلصته وكنت جاي ولسه قاعد بشوف الاجتماع، حكيت اتبعه على السريع على المباشر. فان شاء الله انا معاكم اول باول على تويتر او على اليوتيوب، وخير ان شاء الله نوصل لاهدافنا يا اخواني، هذا هو المهم. وهي مرحله صعبه، اهم شيء نطلع فيها من اقل، يعني هاي المرحله لو نتجاوزها باقل الاضرار الممكنه خلال الفتره القادمه ممتاز جدا يا اخوان، ممتاز جدا. لانه ما فيش شك انه الاسواق راح تنتعش يا اخوان، ما راح تنتعش ان كان 6 اشهر ان كان سنه، الاسواق راح تدخل في بول ماركت بغض النظر شو الوضع الحالي. طب بحب اشكركم يا اخواني جميعا، وشكرا جزيلا للي تابع، وإن شاء الله ألقاكم بالبث القادم أو بالفيديو إن شاء الله القادم، والسلام عليكم.